Shalom all, and welcome to today's Bible study of Genesis to Revelations, Genesis chapters 19 to 24. The topics to be covered is really just important points, especially those relevant to what is needed for human salvation. We have the episode of God destroys Sodom and Gomorrah for the sinning of men sleeping with men. We have Abraham and Abimelech, where he goes to live in Egypt and calls Sarah his sister, his wife Sarah his sister. There's a good explanation to go with that and how it applies to the law. The birth of Isaac, the second son of Abraham after Ishmael. God tests Abraham to kill or sacrifice Isaac. Sarah dies, and then Isaac marries Rebekah, and how that came about. And also points about marriage associated with their coming together or marriage. We left off at chapter 18, where three men had come to Abraham in the beginning of chapters 18. One remained talking with Abraham while Abraham tries to save Sodom and Gomorrah through seeing if he can find 10 righteous people. That person we know to be Yahweh God in human form. And we then start chapter 19, where two of those initial three men who are angels come to Sodom and Gomorrah, where Lot is. Now, as I said, we should know the reason why God is destroying Sodom and Gomorrah for the breaking of his way, one of his the ways of man sleeping with man. And again, we can see from this point that God had his way before it was given to the rest of the world through Moses. So the law that was given to Moses on this point is Leviticus chapters 18, verse 22, which reads, "Thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind. It is an abomination." Abomination is almost the worst sin we can commit. Verse 13, that's 19:13, tells us a little bit about why it has been done. It says, "For we," this is the angel speaking, "will destroy this place because the cry of them is waxen great before the face of Yahweh, and Yahweh hath sent us to destroy it."
So let's read what 19 verse 1 says. "And there came two angels to Sodom at evening, and Lot sat in the gate of Sodom, and Lot, seeing them, rose up to meet them, and bowed himself with his face to the ground." Verse 3. The men wanted to stay outside, and Lot persuaded them to come inside. "And he pressed unto them greatly, and they turned in unto him, and entered into his house, and he made them a feast, and did bake unleavened bread, and they did eat." Now, serving unleavened bread does not mean it was during Passover days of unleavened bread. Simply that Lot did not have time to add raising agent or wait for the thing to rise. And as I just said, the angels then say why they've come: "For we will destroy this place because the cry of them is waxen great before the face of Yahweh, and Yahweh hath sent us to destroy it."
So just like the cry of Abel went up when Cain killed him, the cry of those hurt goes up to God, and he takes action. And notice he takes action by taking human form to perform this action. Or should I say sending angels in human form. Just a minor point, Lot couldn't even persuade his son-in-laws to go with him and be saved. Fortunately, the son-in-laws hadn't turned his daughters against him or against the ways of God. They still were able to listen to their father and go with their father. So once the two angels grabbed hold of the four people, Lot, his wife, and the two daughters, the angels in verse 22 says, "Hasten thee, escape quickly, for I cannot do anything till thou come out." So here we have another example where God takes his righteous people out before he destroys the rest, as he did with Noah. And when they had come out, going to a little small city called Zoar, God rained their fire and brimstone down on Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, as I said, Lot's wife looked back against the instructions of the angels, and she turned to a pillar of salt. We read that in verse 26. Now there was, reading the book, the historian Josephus, he writes that there was for centuries a peculiar formation of crumbling crystalline rock associated with this event. And that's in the Antiquities of Josephus, chapter 1.11.1. And it said it remained up until his day that he saw it. Then we come to the incident of the two daughters having children with their father Lot. Verse 36 and 37. Thus were both the daughters. I should actually start why they did it. In verse 32 it says, "Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that he may preserve seed of our father." And then jump down to 36 and 37. Thus were both the daughters of Lot with child by their father. And the firstborn bare a son, and called his name Moab. The second is the father of the Moabites unto this day. The younger, verse 38 says, and the younger she also bare a son, and called his name Ben-Ami. The same is the father of the children of Ammon unto this day. So why did they do this? They thought that the world was ending, that they were the only ones left, and that when their father died, there'd be no way to continue his name. Now we hear, whereas God punished Cain's descendants for what they did for uncovering Noah's nakedness, that God never said anything that's wrong with what their daughters done. So why is that? As I said, the reason that they did it was not for selfish pleasure or anything, but to preserve a seed for their father, and keep his name going. We see an occasion where God has an instruction about raising up seed to a dead person's lineage, so that their name doesn't die out. In Genesis chapter 38, verse is 8 or so forth. It's an event called Judah and Tamar, where Judah found a Canaanite woman for wife for his son. He had 3 sons, but one of the sons who married Tamar died before he can have children. So Judah said to the second son, we read this in Genesis 38 verse 8, and Judah said unto Onan, go in unto thy brother's wife, and marry her, not literally the ceremony we know of, and raise up seed to thy brother. Now, although the words came from Judah, it was actually an instruction from God, which we'll see in the next few verses. God had killed the first son because he was wicked in God's sight. So, Genesis chapter 38 verse 9, it carries on saying, and Onan knew that the seed should not be his, and it came to pass, when he went in unto his brother's wife, that he spilled it on the ground, lest that he should give seed to his brother. And this is the most important verse. And the thing which he did displeased Yahweh, wherefore he slew him also. So it is an instruction of God that we preserve the name of each man, or the lineage of the sons.
So let's read about these 2 children. These children became Moabites and Amorites and were neighbours. See this in Numbers chapters 21 verse 13, verses 28 to 30, chapter 23 verse 7, and Isaiah chapters 15 verse 1. They were mighty men of war, Isaiah chapter 16 verse 6. They were hostile to Israel until the king Saul subdued them. The daughters thought that since no men were left, especially to raise the name of their father could not be preserved, as I said. Though Canaan was cursed for uncovering his father's nakedness, God never said what the daughters did was wrong. The reasoning was in keeping with the law of preserving a man's name, which I just read you out in Genesis 38, the account, and also in Deuteronomy 25 verse 5. We'll come on to that.
Now, when it comes to Moses and Israel, who forgot all these ways when they went into Egypt, we see when God gave this as a law to them in Deuteronomy chapters 25, verse 5, which says, "If brothers, dwell together, and one of them die," as in Genesis 30 we just read, "and have no child, the wife of the dead," which is, in that case, Tamar, "the wife of the dead shall not marry outside the marriage, outside the family, onto a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go in unto her and take her to him to wife, and perform the duty of an husband's brother unto her." And verse 6, "And it shall be that the firstborn which she beareth shall succeed in the name of his brother which is dead, that his name be not put out of Israel," an instruction of God. Now, with our mentality, we may think this is very odd and maybe not proper, but when we actually look at it from a practical point of view, I think we will see why God's probably done it. And I'm not saying I can think or speak for God, but look at it this way. In a family, they have built up a certain wealth, especially amongst brothers. Maybe one brother helped the other brother build his house, or helped him get the farm, or helped him, and the wife get on in life as family members do. So when that brother dies, it's probably not right or financially fair for all the effort of that dead brother to pass to another family, because the wife then goes and marries some other man, and all the assistance that she was given, now passes to another man. So I think if you look at it that way, that this way God keeps the wealth of that dead husband within the family. And later on we can see the similar mentality when it came to the daughters of Manasseh. I think when all the men died, and they went to Moses and talked to him about the inheritance of the land. The resulting instruction of God was they were to marry within their own nation or tribe, let's say, so that the wealth or land possession stayed within that family's name. Okay, chapter 20, where Abraham journeys, I'll read it from it. Chapter 20, verse 1. "And Abraham journeyed from thence towards the south country, and dwelt between Kadesh and Sur, and sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah his wife, And Abraham said of Sarah his wife, she is my sister. And Abimelech the king of Gerar sent and took Sarah." And if you read the story for yourself, as you're supposed to, you know what happened. I'm going to jump to when God came to Abimelech and told him that he was doing wrong, almost committing adultery. Abimelech said that it was not his fault. He was a righteous person from a righteous nation, and it's because of Abraham and Sarah said why he almost did what he did. And then when he approached Abraham and asked him why he did it, he said that in verse 11, this is Abraham's explanation. "And Abraham said, Because I thought surely the fear of God is not in this place, and they will slay me for my wife's sake. And yet indeed she is my sister. She is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife." Now remember, Abraham did this before in chapters 12, verse 12. Now, some of you may have a little recollection of a law that says that, let's say, a brother should not marry or have intercourse with his sister. That is true. And you may then think, well, Abraham did wrong. But no. The explanation given in verse 12 is very important when we actually compare it to the wording of the law and the customs of the people then, or as God allowed. If we look at where the law is mentioned, Leviticus chapters 18, verse 11, it says, "The nakedness of thy father's wife's daughter, begotten of thy father, she is thy sister, thou shalt not uncover her nakedness. Now we may think that both persons, the male child and the female child, sister, came from the same parents. No, that is true unto the law. If they both have the same mother and both have the same father, then that is your sister, and it's against God's law to then say marry or uncover each other's nakedness. So when we look at verse 12, the point that Abraham, the distinction that Abraham makes is very important. That they both came from the same father, but not the same mother. Abraham had more than one wife, or more than one woman, and therefore, although they both shared the same father, they didn't share the same mother. And we also see this later on with King David. It is in the account is with Tamar, one of the princesses of David called Tamar. It's in 2 Samuel chapter 13 verse 4 where distinction is made between both sons have the same father, and even the daughter Tamar, but not the same mother. So let's say in 2 Kings chapter 13 verse 1, it says, and it came to pass after this that Absalom the son of David had a fair sister whose name was Tamar, and Ammon the son of David loved her. So both of them had David as their father. Verse 4, and he said unto him, why art thou, this one of the servants saying to them, why art thou being a king's son lean from day to day? Wilt thou not tell me? And Ammon said unto him, here he goes, I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister. So in other words, it was not his sister, it was his brother Absalom's sister. They both had the same father, but she came from a different mother, or they came from a different mother. Now if we carry on reading the story, we will know what happened. I won't touch you, you can go. But basically, he ends up raping or trying to force his half-sister, yes, I should have made a distinction, his half-sister, to have sexual things with him. And she says in verse 12, 2 Samuel 13:12, and she answered, nay, my brother, do not force me, for no such thing ought to be done in Israel. Do not thou this folly. And whither shall I cause my shame to go? And as for thee, thou shalt be as one of the fools in Israel. Now, this is what the point I want to make. Now, therefore, I pray thee, speak unto the king, for he will not withhold me from thee.
So, just to go back to the text, half-brothers and sisters can marry, provided they are not from the same mother, i.e. the father with more than one wife. We see this in Leviticus chapters 18, verse 11, which I read out earlier on. That is what happened between Noah's sons and their offspring, i.e. nephews and cousins. See chapter 24, verse 48. It also would have been permissible in the incident of Tamar, Ammon and Absalom, the account I just read out.
In other words, we are halves relatives, brother and sister. If it's done rightly, it is within the law. So that's the main point I wanted to make in Genesis chapters 20. Let's move on to chapter 21 now, which is Isaac's birth. So before I go to chapter 20, just a couple of notes on chapter 19. You look at Numbers 21:13 and 28-30. Also Numbers chapters 23 verse 7 and Isaiah chapters 15 verse 1. That these two children, the Moabites and Amorites, became neighbours in the reference I just gave you. They were mighty men of war, as mentioned in Isaiah chapter 16 verse 6. They were hostile to Israel until King Saul subdued them. And then lastly, another point I've got to make in chapters 20, where what the king of Pharaoh intended to do, i.e. commit adultery with, to him he didn't know would have been adultery, with Sarah, Abraham's wife, it is described in verse 6, and God said, I also withheld thee from sinning against me. It's the same thing that Joseph said to Potiphar's wife. So when we sin, we do not sin against the husband or the wife of the person or against whatever. We sin against God. It is his instructions, his standards, and we're going against his instructions. Therefore, the sin is against him. Now again, this marrying half-sisters is the same thing how the world got populated after Noah. They intermarried, i.e. nephews, the offsprings of each other. Or shall I say nephews and cousins. Similar to what we're going to come across in chapters 24, verse 48, where Isaac marries Rebekah. Abraham sends his servant to get a relative of his to marry Isaac. So that is within the same religious beliefs, if I can call it that. Okay, chapter 21, as I said, Isaac is born. I'm going to read from verse 9. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, which she had borne unto Abraham, mocking. Wherefore she said unto Abraham, cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be here with my son, even with Isaac. As you remember, Ishmael, Abraham's first son, was an Egyptian, or offspring of Egyptian, and he married an Egyptian, in verse 21. And later we also see Joseph's sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, who were part Egyptian, also married Egyptian people. Okay, back to Genesis 21, verse 12. And God said unto Abraham, for in Isaac shall thy seed be called, and also of the son of the bondwoman will I make a nation, because he is thy seed. Verse 25. And Abraham reproved Abimelech because of the well of water, and Abimelech's servants had violently taken away. We see a similar fight over these wells with Isaac in Genesis chapters 26, verse 20, and he didn't reprove the aggressors at that time. So just like Abraham in this chapter 21 makes an agreement with Abimelech, his son Isaac does the same in chapters 26, verse 26. On to chapter 22, where God tests Abraham. Now we all know the story, I suppose, a famous story, where God calls Abraham out to go and do a sacrifice to him using his son. I read from 22:1. And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here I am. And he said, take thou thy son, thy only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of the Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee. So again, burnt offerings existed before Moses. We saw them before with Noah, and we shall see them again with Moses and Israel in Leviticus chapter 1, which deals with burnt offerings. Now it is said by now, Isaac is not just a little boy, a little lad. He's about 30 or so years old, if I remember rightly. But the main point I want to make in this chapter is verse 7. And Isaac spake unto Abraham his father, and said, My father. And he said, Here am I, my son. And he said, Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So they went, both of them, together. Now again, this is another proof that these things existed before Moses, as I said, because firstly, the son knew the criteria of a burnt offering. He knew it wasn't a dog or a donkey or a cat or anything like that. He knew what was required. So Abraham had taught him the requirements of burnt offerings and other things. So we ought to stop thinking that these things started with Israel and were only given to Israel and they were just for Israel. Okay, I'm going to jump down to reading from verse 11, because again we should know the story, but just to make this point. And the angel of Yahweh called unto him, this is when Abraham went to sacrifice his son, just before he did it, out of heaven, and said, Abraham. Abraham, and he said, Here am I. Verse 12. And he said, Lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thy only, from me. So, as Scripture says in the New Testament, 2. The fear of God is the beginning of all wisdom, and seek first the kingdom of God, and he will give everything unto you. So Abraham didn't rationalize in his head that he shouldn't kill his son, his loved son, and so forth. He just obeyed God and left it to God to work the rest of it out. And Yeshua says in the New Testament, anyone that puts father and mother or anything before him is not worthy of him. Now, of course, God doesn't allow human sacrifice. We read this in Leviticus chapters 18, verses 21, and Deuteronomy 18:10. That was a practice of other pagan religions. In verse 18, this is 22:18, the same promise that God made to Abraham is repeated here. And in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice. The reason is clearly stated again. Verse 20, chapter 23 where Sarah dies. Abraham goes to buy some place to bury his wife Sarah, and the agreement is witnessed in chapter 23 verse 10. It reads, And Ephron dwelt among the children of Heth, and Ephron the Hittite answered. This is who Abraham asked for the land. Abraham in the audience of the children of Heth, even of all that went in at the gate of his city, saying, and they made agreement. So it was witnessed by the elders in the gates of the city. Almost we read this with Absalom in 2 Samuel, but I want to also draw attention about these things being done in the gates, or shall I say at the gate, in the Proverbs about a virtuous woman, which does all this hard work and all the things she does, and then what it says about her husband, verse 23. This is 10:33. Her husband is known in the gates when he sitteth among the elders of the land. So that's where he acts as an elder to witness contracts and things like that of the community. So that was the main thing about chapters 23, Sarah's death and burial. We now come on to chapter 24, Genesis 24, where this deals with Isaac marrying Rebekah. To give you the context, I'll read very quickly from verse 1. And Abraham was old and well stricken in age, and Yahweh had blessed Abraham in all things. And Abraham said unto his eldest servant of his house that ruled, we came across this word ruled in one of the earlier lessons. I think it was, we talked about Genesis chapter 4, verse 7, about Cain should take rule of sin. Okay, that ruled over all that he had. Put, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh, and I will make thee swear by Yahweh God of heaven and the God of earth, that thou shalt not take a wife unto my son of the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell. So unlike Judah, who married people from Canaan, and Esau, who married them as other foreign women as well, and Ishmael, the Egyptian, we see Abraham wants to keep everything in the religious context of his faith. He doesn't want to risk, like Solomon, marrying the wrong person, and he gets strayed away from the God of his father Abraham. So Abraham explains the situation, the promise he has from God, sends his servant to find a suitable relative, suitable wife for his son Isaac. And we read this in Deuteronomy chapter 7 verse 3, the same instruction is given to the children of Israel through Moses. That reads, Neither shalt thou make marriages with them, the daughter thou shalt not give unto his son, nor his daughter shalt thou take unto thy son. And again, you're supposed to read the whole chapter for yourself. I'm going to pick up the story at verse 48, where the servant has met Rachel at the well, and he's now come back to meet her parents. And he's telling them his mission. He says, "And I bowed down my head and worshipped Yahweh and blessed Yahweh, God of my father Abraham, which had led me in the right way to take my master's brother's daughter unto his son." And then we know eventually the parents allow her to go. The next verse I want to draw attention to is verse 63, where the servant and Rebekah is now coming to meet Isaac back to place. And verse 63 says, "And Isaac went out to meditate in the field at the evening tide. And he lifted up his eyes and saw, and behold, the camels were coming." So this evening tide was also arbitrary times, the same time we see set in Daniel when he was praying, when sacrifices were made morning and evening, and also in the New Testament. So times of prayer, appointed times, were set before it was given to Israel, and because this is just a way of God. Now, although the times is not mentioned in Daniel chapters 6:10, which I just read it for your convenience. Now, when Daniel knew that the thing was signed, he went into his house and his windows being opened in his chamber towards Jerusalem. He kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as did before time. However, the times are mentioned in Psalms chapters 55, verse 17, which says, "Evening and morning and at noon will I pray and cry aloud. He shall hear my voice." That concludes the points for today, and shalom. Hopefully I'll see you or we speak again tomorrow.